Thank you very much. Hey everyone, I want to talk to you today about a little bit of a life of adventure. I have the same background that many of you have. I studied electronic engineering right here in the UCD. And I didn't really know what that was going to lead to. I just found the one thing that I was good at. I was good at maths, I was good at science, and I rolled with it. And I didn't know where that would take me, and what happened was I did just okay in my final exams, and I kind of felt a little disappointed. I didn't want to be just an okay engineer, and in the end, my engineering did come back to help me a lot. And I want to talk about how that ties in with this whole Jason Bourne idea. So after I finished my engineering degree, I started world travels. And I had been homeless for 13 years. Everything I owned had to weigh less than 23 kilograms, because that's the weight limit. And I would go to places for 3 months at a time, because that's the tourist visa limit. And I would just keep hopping around. And as I did, come on in. As I was hopping around, I tried to learn the local language. And I know a lot of people here have the ability to speak multiple languages. You might have done English as you were growing up, if you're from another country. You might have had an experience living abroad as an intern or done an Erasmus year. I didn't have that myself. I barely passed German for the Leaving Cert. I just got a low C. And then I moved to Spain after I graduated, lived there for 6 months, and I just spoke English the whole time. But something changed along the way. I figured out what I was doing wrong, and I figured out how I could hack language learning. So I'll get to that in a little bit, but first I want to get to the kind of stuff that I try to do with my career to see how I could find this job that could really make a difference, how I could feel like I am having an adventure while I'm working. So I've had a lot of different positions over the 13 years traveling. I'm a blogger. My blog gets 1 million unique visitors per month. Very big blog. I don't have any background in English, writing English, I should say, and I managed to do that. Professional speaker, like now. If I hold the same hand, like this, yeah. Of course, written a few books. I wrote these 4 books over the last year, had another book before that. I was a professional translator. This is the first time that I managed to have a lot of fun with engineering. Because for many years, I didn't really know what to do with my engineering degree. I thought maybe, it was fun, I studied it, but it's not going to tie in with something else I might want to do. But after I learned the languages, and I did some certificates in the languages, it turned out I was in a unique position because there are very few English-speaking engineers who speak other languages. It's one reason why they're so sought after in Google. Obviously, you're going to bump into a lot of multilingual engineers in this building. It's not going to happen as likely in other buildings. So I took that and I translated. I translated technical documents from French, Spanish, and Italian to English. And that was the first job that let me travel the world as a location-independent worker. I've also been a consultant. Those are all recent jobs. But like I said, I've had many, many, many jobs. I was a youth hostel receptionist. I was an English teacher, because you end up doing that a lot while you travel. I was a maths teacher. Ended up using that. Worked for Johns Hopkins University. This was for what we lovingly call nerd camp. The happiest place on earth. I loved it. I got to put some energy into teaching them about Pythagoras. I was saying, in a world where this cult of people who worship triangles. And it's great. It's the kind of place you can do that. So I used a lot of that in my travels. I got to teach maths. I got to use engineering principles. And of course, I actually worked as an engineer. I worked in Paris this is my gorgeous desk with the chaotic mess all over it, where I was translating software and working as a pre-sales engineer. Okay. But I'm still not done. There's so many other jobs I've had. My first job when I was 12 was a FTSE 100 investor because I was the only guy in my town who knew how to use a computer. And someone just wanted to invest in the FTSE 100 and he didn't know how to use the software. So I stepped up to it. And I was tech support at the local computer store. I had a lot of office jobs. This thing here, that is a laryngeal mask array that you put on your larynx after surgery. And the only reason I know that is because I arranged the world's literature on laryngeal mask arrays alphabetically and chronologically over 2 months. Yes. Very, very not fun, that job. I was a race car controller. Not in the Mario world. I wasn't in that universe of Super Nintendo. But I was someone controlling the race cars because I used my engineering background to kind of explain that I could use the equipment better. And then, nothing to do with engineering, I ran a yoga shop. The only reason I got that job is because it was in California, and they found my Irish accent charming. They found it soothing. So I didn't even know, so like a pregnant lady might come in and say, which yoga mat is better for me as a pregnant lady? And I'd be like, you know, as an Irish lad, I would say this mat has good zen. Not really knowing what I was talking about. And it worked. I was a first aid assistant. Do a quick first aid course and you can work in these camps like the one I was working at. And I could actually help the kids when they ran into medical problems. Okay, so that's kind of just an overview of the kind of work that I've had. I've met people who have used a lot of their technical abilities to really get out there and travel the world with it. You could do web development and coding, and you could be an online coach. You can write like I've done. Met people who earn a living playing poker, just on these online forums and stuff. And there's loads of other location-independent jobs. But the big question I always get is when you're traveling is how you can afford it. So all those jobs I mentioned, I didn't have those lined up for me when I arrived somewhere. I had to actually figure out how to spend less money. So in the whole kind of Jason Bourne theme, this behind me is Palolem Beach. That's the beach that Jason Bourne was living in the second movie. It was shot there the same summer that I was living there. I didn't even realize it. This was back when it was being shot. And I always kind of see, kind of have this Jason Bourne lifestyle. And I have 3 passports. I managed to hack that one too. And this beach, never ran into him. Wish I did. But this hut here on this beach in India, I got it for about €4 a night. And the thing that got it for me was learning how to integrate with the culture. This for me is like the feeling of being a spy. Is I got to try to see how well I can blend in. So I traveled to India with an Indian friend of mine. And he owed me a lot of favors because I was very active in Couchsurfing, if you guys have ever heard of that website. I've hosted over 2,000 Couchsurfers. I used Couchsurfing as a means to practice languages for free. Because as I would be living somewhere for 3 months, since I had all of those jobs, I'd be able to afford to get an okay apartment to myself. But I found that when I did that, I wasn't actually interacting with a lot of people. Whereas before, when I would be I would have flatmates, I would be using them as my circle of friends. But with Couchsurfing, I would just welcome people to my home. And I would try to practice languages with them or get to know their culture. And one time in Brazil, I hosted 55 people at the same time during the carnival for a whole week. Very, very long queues for the bathroom that week. And Those 55 people, one of them included Rahul, my Indian friend. So years later when I met him in India, I said, I really want to get to know the country. And he said, I'm not just going to show you the country, Benny. I'm going to show you how to think like an Indian. So a place like this, if you were to walk up to it and have a white face, they would say €20 a night, which actually seems like a pretty good price when you compare it to what we would be used to paying. But my friend, he said, no. That's not how it works in India. You got to haggle. And I was like, oh, haggle. Okay, so if they say 20, I say 10, and we meet in the middle. And he's like, no. That's not how it works. The way it works, if you're ever in India and you want to haggle the price, and this has actually worked for me around the world, it's a very good psychological technique, you never mention the price yourself. You just mention the reasons it should go down. So I walked up to this place. The lady was ready to share it with us. And I said, oh, how much is this? And she said the equivalent in rupees of about €20. And I was like, €20? No, it's okay. And I started walking away, like just disappointed. And then she said, okay, €15. And I looked over my shoulder and I was like, I don't know. It's like right on the beach. How am I supposed to sleep at night with all the waves crashing? You know, I don't think so. I started walking away again, and she said, okay, €10. And still, I wasn't looking at her, and like warmly showing, yeah, I'm definitely going to get this. You gotta be obnoxiously uninterested. So I was like looking over my shoulder, like the place was like smelling bad. Looking at it thinking, ugh. But isn't it facing the sun? How am I supposed to read a book on this balcony with the sun in my eyes? And she's like, oh, okay, fine. And keep in mind, this is the sun setting over a beautiful landscape, with a gorgeous view of an island and everything. But I reframed it. And I kept giving more and more reasons. I was like, yeah, how's the AC? Does it have various settings? And she was like, well, there's just a fan. It's like, just a fan? Okay, no way. And then eventually I got it down to the €3 or €4 that it was. So a lot of what I've tried to do to get the price of everything lower is to try to understand the local culture. Try to integrate better. And this has given me that Jason Bourne sense of being a spy, that I'm almost going to be mistaken for a local. It's not going to happen in India, but what my goal has been in countries like India and China is be mistaken for somebody who's lived there for a very long time. And then they're less likely to take advantage of you. So in Egypt, for instance, I wanted to get better prices. So the first thing I did was try to learn a little bit of Egyptian Arabic in advance. And whenever people think about learning a language, they think the best thing to do is to go to the location, fly to the country. And I didn't find this worked for me, because when I got to Spain first, I got off the plane and I just imagined in my head, I'm in the country, so I'm just going to automatically learn the language. I'm going to inhale Spanish air and exhale Espanol. But that didn't happen, because I gravitated towards the English speakers. So I've skipped all of that. And what I do now that I feel is a lot more useful is I learn via the internet. I find someone and Google Hangout, or I Skype them, or I text them, WhatsApp, or whatever I can do, and I get in touch, and we practice that way. I have a certain virtual immersion. This for me has been a game changer, because it means I put the time into learning the language, but then when I get to the country, I'm not in language learning mode, I'm in culture learning mode. So in Egypt, for instance, when I first arrived, I had some basic Egyptian Arabic, enough to get some conversations. And they still spoke back to me in English. And I was like, I don't get it, what's going on? I put all this work in. But then I tried something different. I sat down in a cafe, pen and paper, and I started making notes of how Egyptian men around my age were different to me. And maybe I wasn't showing the culture enough respect. I wasn't trying to integrate. And I actually noticed a lot of things. I noticed that they groomed themselves differently. I needed to grow out like a beard. Didn't do a very good job. My Facebook friends called it a porn tash, you know. But I got somewhere. I was trying. And I would wear like t-shirts, shorts, cap, and they don't dress like that in Egypt. So I tried to integrate everything, and I even learned how to walk like an Egyptian. And it's not this. If you've ever played the old game Frogger, where you gotta like hop across the road like this and go between the cars, that's kind of what life in Egypt, in Cairo especially, is like. You have 8 lanes of traffic, never a pedestrian crossing. So if you ever want to walk like an Egyptian, just like grab your phone and just kind of stroll across like this. And the cars will swerve around you, and everyone will think, that Egyptian guy, he knows what he's doing. You know? And after I did that, whenever I tried to find accommodation or haggle the price of something, it changed a lot. It wasn't just speaking the language, it was speaking the culture. And that gets prices down dramatically. So that's kind of something to keep in mind. If you wanted to travel, you don't actually have to have wads of cash for it. You just have to try to get to know how people do it locally. But the way you use the wads of cash does make a difference. It's all about mentality. So I do have to admit, it's true, I'm a millionaire. Let's get that out there. This is proof. This is me holding 1 million Indonesian rupiah, which is about 80 euro. So the lifestyle you lead makes you feel like a millionaire sometimes, even if you're just an Indonesian millionaire. So I try to see, how can I hack those things? How can I try to get things that would not necessarily be that expensive but still feel expensive? And for that, I would try to get the right connections. So I tried to learn to be more outgoing, which was hard for me. I was a very shy person. Growing up in university, I became the best player of Snake for the Nokia phone, because every time I go out to socialize, I'd like pretend like I'm texting, you know, my thousands of friends, that I'm like so busy texting all the time, when I was just playing that game on the phone. Because I couldn't approach people. I was so scared of what they would think. But I found that just letting go of that a little bit and trying to get to know a lot of people has given me a lot of connections to get to do a lot of things that I always thought only millionaires could do. So whenever people would ask me, you know, how can I do that if I'm shy, you know? And the best example I can think of that I was able to change this for somebody was while I was learning German in Berlin. One of my methods of learning the language is to speak only in that language, sticking to that, of never switching to English while I'm in the several hours time I'm using the language. So I met a German lady, and she wanted to practice English. And she was introduced to me by some friends of hers. And she never would have walked up to me, because she told me the first thing she said is that she's very shy. And she wanted to practice English, but I was in German mode. So I still wanted to help her. I wanted to like give her some advice. And there were some Americans in the same event, so I wanted to like make sure she could talk to them. And I said, yeah, those guys there, I was talking to them before. They're very friendly. You should go say hi. And she said, I can't do that. I'm too shy. And I didn't want to just like, you know, do the work for her. I wanted to help her get over the shyness. So I tried to think to myself, how can I show this lady how she can do it so that when I'm gone, she'll be able to approach people and expand her social circle to learn English better. And then I had an idea. So she was holding a glass of something, some drink. And I said, do you know how blood flow to your brain makes you smarter? And she was like, that doesn't sound right. I was like, yeah. Trust me. Like, if you were to raise your arm, for instance, then more blood goes down up into your brain, and you will be smarter. And this whole time, she was very, very confused and wondering, you know, this guy's kind of weird. What's he talking about? But what she didn't know is we were kind of moving in a particular direction. So I was moving her towards those two American guys and completely distracting her with this nonsense about blood and hands and stuff. And then, at the right moment, when we were close enough, and I was moving her arm up and down, I clinked her glass against theirs and I ran away. Then, 1 hour later, she came up to me and she said she had the best night ever. She got to talk to these guys. She found out they live in the same neighborhood. They're going to be hanging out all weekend long. And she made all of these connections. And what she realized was that the shyness she was feeling was mostly a lot of self-fulfilling prophecy. She was telling herself, if I go up to them, they're going to laugh at me for trying. They're going to think my English is bad. They're going to think my pronunciation is off. They're going to think I'm not an interesting person. But what I did is I took all of that away from her. I took the ability to talk herself out of it. I took it away. And by just presenting the moment, she just said, hello. And it went from there. And that's the kind of thing that I do when I want to expand my network, to expand my opportunities to have that different lifestyle. I see somebody that I would like to talk to, and I don't start an inner dialogue of, okay, what's a clever way to start a conversation with that person? No, if I say that, they're going to think I'm an idiot. And I wouldn't think that. I just see someone, hello. So try to think of that. If you want to get out of your shell and you want to experience different things, and you see an opportunity, grab it immediately. Do not even think for a second. That is going to lead to so many more things. It might lead to some embarrassment. You might make a couple of mistakes. But my whole lifestyle, especially thanks to language learning, is I have a goal to make at least 200 mistakes a day. And when you go up to somebody, you try to talk to them, most of the time it's fine. Everything works out great. And sometimes they kind of are confused whether you talk to them. Then you just be like, okay, great. It's one of my mistakes. Ticked off the list. And it helps a lot when you do that with so many aspects of life. Okay? And then, of course, it helps you to feel like you get to live a lot richer. The kind of people I've met, they've given me these kind of different opportunities. When I went to Japan, for instance, I tried to build a relationship with my Airbnb host. I was emailing him in advance, but then we arrived and the keys were not left out for me. And I was tired, exhausted from jet lag, and kind of sitting outside. I couldn't get in touch with him, and I was starting to get frustrated. And I kind of knocked on the neighbor's door, and I said, is there any chance you guys would have a key to this apartment? And it turned out that it's kind of illegal to do Airbnb hosting in the building he was at. So the police were called. They came in, and they wanted to take a statement from me. And I wasn't in trouble. They were trying to protect because they were very protective of the tourism industry. They didn't want foreigners to be taken advantage of. But they were like, did you pay him money to stay here? And that was the moment when suddenly I forgot all the Japanese that I had been learning. And I was like, what? Sorry, no, I just forgot it all. I had spoken Japanese up to that moment, and somehow it just disappeared from my head. And so I wasn't able to take a very solid statement with them. And I called this guy the next day thinking, I put myself out there for you. You did not give me this accommodation for this tiny little room that I wanted. And he was so appreciative that I tried to help him. He put me up in a penthouse apartment with a 270-degree panoramic view of Kyoto. And I was there for a week and a half. And that was from paying the same amount for a tiny little shoebox, hidden away in a small street. So a lot of the time, I make my travels about building these relationships, trying to do people favors if I can, and then to see how that comes back to me. Another way that you can make sure that it doesn't cost you as much is to not make it about stuff, owning things. This, for instance, is something I used to own. This is my backlit, for my project Speaking Klingon. I actually did attend the Star Trek convention. I got to meet Leonard Nimoy, the late and great. And I use this picture because I actually had to buy a backlit. This is very sharp. You can't travel with it. And it was interesting for me because it was so big, and I was just looking at it thinking, there's no way this will fit in my bag. And I don't tend to get a lot of stuff, and that helps me feel more free. I found that when people tie themselves down with the furniture and the plants they have to water and the pets they have to feed, you do a lot of these things, you'll find you don't have the same kind of freedom to maybe move to a different place in the same city, or to go off on an adventure for a week, because you'll be thinking, oh, but who's going to feed Fido? You know? So apart from a backlit, which I sold a week later, because I only kind of rented it in a way, try to not own stuff. Okay? And then, of course, there's the whole, how can you travel practically? So I want to just give you some websites very quickly here. You want to get cheaper flights? Use these meta search engines. I'm sure you would have heard of them, like Skyscanner and so on. Here's two other ones. Adioso, I like this one because it kind of uses natural English, you know. And Google Flights obviously is taking a lot of like better traffic away from these sites. I found a lot of better flights come up on that now. And even FlightFox, I don't know if you guys have heard of that one. That's like a service that you can pay somebody to try to research all of the flight options for you. And like, I have gotten the most amazing like business class around the world from some weird offer that only some experts know, and I got that for like the extra 49. So there's a lot of tricks like that that you can try to feel like you're always flying business class or whatever. Okay, so the last thing to talk about very quickly, and then I want to hear any of your questions about travel and working and language learning and so on, is the language learning aspect. So when I try to learn a language, I try to see, how can I learn this like an engineer? And I feel like that has been the biggest advantage that I've had, my engineering background in language learning. Because a lot of people I've met, when they try to get into learning a language as an adult, have too much of a perfectionist attitude to it. They feel like they can't speak unless they don't make any mistakes. Now, the problem with that is language is a means of communication between people. It's not about being perfect, it's about getting your point across. And I always tell people that the first moment I realized I could speak another language was in Spain, when I was like just 2 weeks into my project of trying to speak just Spanish. My electric toothbrush broke. And I was furious. I couldn't afford the €10 I spent on this. So I stormed down to the supermarket to demand a refund. I found the manager and I said, I don't know how to say toothbrush in Spanish. Or broken. Or refund. So I wasn't actually able to express all those things, but something happened in that moment. Just the fact that, like I said before, I wasn't over-analyzing. I wasn't thinking about it too much. In that moment, I realized I should just do what I can. I wanted to achieve this thing. So I said, diente, máquina, malo. Tooth machine, bad. Dinero, ida y vuelta. Money, return trip. And you know what? It worked. I got my money back. And like, even with that abysmal Tarzan Spanish, I was able to achieve something. And this is what I've learned in terms of language hacking, is that I try to just achieve the goal of communication. And as a beginner, that's what I try to do, not perfectionism. And the reason that this ties into the engineering is because from the first jobs I've had, we as engineers have a ship it mentality. If you're making software, you have a deadline. And by the time that deadline's reached, then you wrap up the code and it's ready. And the same with if you're building a device, building the next Nexus. You have to finish it by a date. But on that date, you know there might be still things you can improve. Maybe the latest chip just came out and you could technically kind of try to put it in. Or maybe you didn't realize if there was like a part of the code that you could try to analyze to make sure you could get the the lines down by just a couple, you know, because it always helps just the speed ever so slightly. But we don't do that. In engineering, we try to ship it. You just get something done so it's very good, but not perfect. We have thermodynamics and mechanical engineering and structural engineering. You lose things that way. Perfectionism can't be the goal. Mistakes are inevitable, so just let them happen. And that's what I do with languages. I try to have a deadline, get what I can done before then, and reach a particular milestone and be happy with that, rather than aiming for perfectionism, because that's impossible. There's nobody in this room who speaks any language perfectly, including me and English as a native speaker. There are always things I'm learning, always new words. Like, I made the dumbest mistake a few months ago when my partner and I were hanging out, and I said something like, "Oh, I love you, hubby." And she said, "Do you know what that word means?" And I was like, yeah, it's a term of endearment. And she said, "Yeah, for husband. You just called me your husband." And I was like, "Oh, okay." So I'm still learning English. So if you keep that in mind, you will never reach the stage of perfectionism, but maybe you can reach those milestones. And this, for me, is what I've taken away from my engineering, especially as I apply it to languages. I try to have a systematic approach, try to get the best shortcuts, reach a goal, and then start a new project for the language 2.0. So that's a little bit of what I wanted to talk about, and I want to make sure I get to any of your questions. So let me know if there's anything on your mind.
Anyone? Thumbs up.
We got one here.
For me, personally, one of the concerns when I'm about to shut up somebody somewhere is that they will be afraid of me because I'm kind of tall and I have this beard. I don't think it's particularly threatening, but I just sometimes just notice this kind of look when, you know, I say hi, and they're like, Did you get that, and how would you deal with this?
Yeah, no, I have, believe it or not, I found that even when I'm not trying to, I have come across as threatening in some cultures. And when I was living in Taiwan, for instance, I found that I was people were kind of keeping their distance from me. But then I realized a lot of it was my body language. So it might not be that you're tall. It might be that you're walking confidently, you know? And maybe in these countries you actually walk a little bit meekly. And you kind of say, "Oh, excuse me," you know? It depends on where you are. But then it could be your voice. Maybe you have a very deep voice. And you might try to soften it a little bit. Maybe it's your facial expression. I found in some places that I actually, if I raised my eyebrows, and these are things that I've actually sat down and tried to statistically analyze. I've been like, okay, how many guys have their eyebrows up here? Okay, yeah, Tuesday was a good 73%. Okay, interesting. You know, you try to see that information. You might be surprised. Another thing before you travel is try to watch some online streamed television. You know, maybe watch some telenovelas from South America, or see if you can watch some like news shows from Italy, whatever country you're in. You'll find maybe you have to actually be more outgoing, be more confident. And I to this day, I remember while I was studying for a C2 exam in Spanish. One of the guys I was studying with was Swedish, and his Spanish was way better than mine. He knew the most obscure words. His accent, he sounded like a radio announcer. If you close your eyes, you would think he's Spanish. And yet, all the Spanish people I hung out with, they said they kind of feel weird around him. And it's because he kind of walked around with like this. His eyes were open very widely. And he had a very stiff way of talking to people. Whereas me, with a more noticeable accent, I was kind of like, "Hey, ¿qué tal? You know, cabrón, ¿qué haces?" And people actually, they like that. They like the more relaxed style. So it depends. It depends on where you're going. But try to think of those things. Don't think of Because maybe if it is in part the fact that you're tall, well, you can't change that, so who cares? Just that's out of the picture. What can you change? Let's try to look into that. Okay? Yeah. And I think you were next. Yeah, sorry. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I don't think I need the mic, I don't know, but I have a smattering of like Spanish, French, German, you know, little bits of everything. I'll always say I can never go hungry or thirsty in a country. But every time I'm in Germany, I can speak Spanish. When I'm in Spain, I can speak German. So how do you prepare your mind for the country that you're actually going to? Is there a trick? Is there a little...
Yeah, for me, the projects I've tried to just go to the country and like jump into the language, it's been very difficult. I've found that, yeah, my brain is like in the wrong language. So you have to hit the ground running. So before going, I would get online. I would try to talk to people. So one of my favorite resources is a website, italki, italki.com. We actually integrated them into the language hacking courses that we've been working on. And this is an online community of people that you can Skype and you can like talk to in whatever tool you want, and you can have a free exchange. Doesn't cost you a penny. If you do 20 minutes in their language, 20 minutes in English, or you can get teachers who are actually very affordable because they live in cheaper countries. So what I would do before going to a country is get consistent practice for weeks ahead of it. You know, I would not leave it to the last minute and then on the plane over, I'd be like, oh, you know, how did I say I'm hungry again? And like try to cram it, because it's too much pressure. And the whole thing for me especially is you need momentum. So I would try to get them up to that level. And then another thing is if you have multiple languages, the best thing I found to have a solid enough level that you don't even need to worry about that, like you can still take a break of a few months and be able to like switch back into speaking it, is to focus on learning one language till you get it to a very good level. Because I've never had success in trying to learn multiple languages at the same time at low levels. So my whole process has been like a 3-month project where I am intensively studying this language to see how high I can get it. If I'm lucky, I'll get it to like a lower intermediate, or B1 as they call them on the European Common Framework, or sometimes even a B2. I wouldn't aim for the higher ones in a shorter time, but I'd get to that stage where I'm effectively fluent in social situations. But when I get to that stage, I feel like I've built a very strong wall around the language in my mind. So it's less likely to kind of leak into the other languages. So my whole process is learn each language up to that B2 like solid level, and then maybe start the next language. And it's okay if I take a break. Because having a bunch of languages at a lower level, it's very, very hard to distinguish them. They're going to influence each other. But if you can build that wall, that's a lot better. Yeah. And do you want to jump in with your question?
Thank you. I just wanted to know whether you think that this fluent in the 3 months process would work in the same way for somebody who's dyslexic.
Absolutely. Oops. So firstly, my whole philosophy, like the blog Fluent in 3 months, that's based off specificity. Because I found when I first started to try to learn Spanish, didn't have any end goals. I just wanted to learn Spanish. And my blog, as you can imagine, gets a big spike of traffic on January 1st from everyone saying, New Year's resolution, I want to learn Italian. I don't think that's a very good idea. I think the specifics in it. So maybe people get to know those levels and maybe they want to aim for a B1 or B2 in 3 months or 6 months or whatever. So that's like what my strategy would be. But for the whole process for me to get to at least basic conversation level is speak from day one and only speak. The whole reading and writing and like tidying up your grammar, that, I think, is, for a lot of people, it's not useful as a beginner. It is useful later. So you can reach the stage where your conversation in the language without having to worry about reading it. And in fact, some methods that I found online intentionally get people to not read because you have a big advantage there of not getting influenced by English spelling. So if anything, you should take that as seeing what kind of strengths would that give you? Because you can avoid all of that. There are loads of listening tools. And if you just focus on the sounds of the language rather than trying to associate spelling and so on, you don't have to learn how to read and write initially. You might want to do that later, and then maybe later you'll decide you don't even want to if the only thing you care about is speaking the language. So I always try to see that, and I would only try to improve my reading and writing much later on. So you might want to decide you don't even want to do that in a language. Okay? And look here. Okay.
How do you handle comprehension?
Yeah, very good question. Because when you're speaking to somebody in a language, then they might speak back to you, and you will hear. So I think, again, the perfectionist way of looking at that is that was a large bunch of noise that I don't understand, so I give up. But what I try to do is a couple of things. Like once, for instance, the TEDx picture I showed up, that was in Warsaw, and I gave myself just a couple of hours, literally an hour and a half to learn Polish. And after that, I got on Skype, and I was like, I'm going to Skype in Polish, and I'm going to not speak any English. And of course, pretty much everything that was said back to me was gobbledygook. So I still managed to have a conversation. I hacked that conversation. Because if you're doing it on online voice call, then you just text them, or text type them. So what I would do is, I would look up what I want to say, and Tarzan connect it all up. I'm sure it was a horrible sentence, but I would say something like the equivalent of, me Benny, me Ireland. And they'd say, blah, blah, blah. And I'd be, okay, and I type, I'm sorry, could you type that? And then they type it, and I would copy and paste it into Google Translate, see what effectively what they're saying, and then be like, okay, all right. And then I would try to come up with my reply using some dictionaries. And so I kind of cheated that way. And that got me the initial momentum. So that's one way to do it online. But then in person, you have to let go of the perfectionism. So instead, I would think of it as a guesstimation process. So I wrote my undergraduate thesis in trellis code modulation. This is a style of encoding we have in telephone calls that decides that some information is going to be lost because no system is perfect. So I imagine language learning to be a little bit like that. So imagine this. Imagine you're having a telephone call with somebody in English, and it was a very bad line. And all you heard was dinner, Friday. So you could decide, didn't understand that at all. It's pointless. You'll just have to tell them to start over or say, look, we'll just text each other. But there's another thing you can do. You can guess. It's probable that they're saying something like, would you like to go out for dinner on Friday? It's likely. It's less likely that they're going to say, the alien invasion begins on Friday and you are going to be their dinner. So you think to yourself, in terms of probability, it's likely they're saying that. So when I'm learning another language, I'll hear this stream of noise that there's no possible way I can give a good translation of. But maybe there's one word that I try to catch. So I never think to myself, as they're speaking, I'm not thinking, how can I understand this entire sentence? I'm thinking, can I catch a single word out of that? And maybe they will say the single word that I happen to understand. And if I don't, then I'll try to say, could you say that again using different words, please? And they may, in fact, actually say the word that I need to guess. And sometimes when you guess, you'll guess wrong. And the earth has never opened up and swallowed me whole when that happens. They see I'm misunderstanding and we work around it. So in terms of comprehension, you could do that. And then final little trick I'd say is I would listen to slowly spoken out language. And there's a lot of online podcast series that do this very well. So what they do is they start by giving a 15-second exchange, like maybe just buying something and saying that cost that much, thank you. And they spend 15 minutes explaining that, explaining each word. And you start with that, and then you push yourself up. And they're like, they actually follow the European framework, and you get to the A2 level, and maybe they have a 30-second exchange, and they only explain the hardest parts. So pushing yourself up in notches helps a lot. When I first moved to Spain, and they spoke this machine gun Spanish at me, it was impossible for me to understand. But I found that if I had these kind of slower conversations, I started to speak with other learners, not just native speakers. I learned most of my Spanish from Erasmus students, from French and German and Italian students, because they would speak slowly to me. And that didn't mean I was going to speak slowly for the rest of my life. It meant I got that initial momentum to work my way up to eventually be able to have more confident, fast conversations. So a few different suggestions for you there. Okay? Yeah.
Thanks. You probably have been to many interesting situations during your work travel. If you can share how your Jason Bourne kind of cultural language skills helped you to get out of some of the tricky ones.
Okay. All right. I'd say the trickiest situation I had was in Brazil, where I essentially got detained by the federal police. What happened was I had been in Brazil for 3 months, and I was having the best time ever, and I wanted to stay longer. And you don't have to do a visa run. If you're a tourist, you can just go to the federal police and ask them if you can stay longer, and they stamp your passport, and that's it. And I decided I wanted to do that. And I went in, and of course, I had to queue for 5 hours. Very slow, bureaucratic process. I finally got to my turn, and she said, "Where's your 20 reais payment?" And I was like, "Well, here you go." And she's like, no, you've got to go to the bank, pay them, and then give us the receipt. So I did that. I came back, and I had to start over again. So by the time it was my turn, I was so frustrated that I was in a very bad mood. I was angry. And I was like, "I'm back. Here's the payment. Stamp my passport, please." And she was like, in Portuguese, she was saying, "You can't speak to me like that. I'm a federal police officer." And I was like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. Here, please, pretty please." She said, "Okay, if you're going to be like that." And she stamped my passport for 1 day. Which meant there was nothing I could do. I couldn't go to another place to get it extended. I was furious. I had so many things outlined, things I had paid for in advance and like flights and everything. So mad that I went out into the queue and I was like cursing all of my worst Portuguese, saying, "This, you know what, has a stick up her, you know what, and she's la la la." And so like I said horrible, horrible things, and I didn't realize that the window was open and she heard everything. So she came out, grabbed me, threw me in a room and locked me there. And she said, we are going to officially arrest you. Now, being arrested was not on my itinerary. That was going to mess up my travel plans very much. So I had to think quickly. I had to think, okay, what would Jason Bourne do? Or what would MacGyver do in this situation to escape? Is there like a paperclip I can use to get out of this place? And then I was thinking, and then I realized what I had to do. I had a plan through what I had learned those 3 months in trying to understand Brazilian culture. And instead of herself, I knew that another police officer, a guy, he was going to come in, and he looked mad. He looked like he was probably her brother. And he had heard what I said. So he was ready to give me hell. But while he was kind of like leaving the papers and coming back, I thought to myself, okay, I concentrated really, really hard on Torlinus, the pet turtle I had when I was 6 years old, who died. And I thought really hard, and I was like, poor Torlinus, I remember burying him. And like a tear started coming down. So he came back in, and he was like, "You arrogant foreigners, you don't know what's going on." And I was like, "I'm so sorry." And I bawled in tears. And the reason I did that is because I realized this macho culture didn't really know how to handle men crying. And he started getting very awkward, and he was like, "Stop crying this instant. We need to talk about this." And I'm like, "I'm sorry. I want my mommy." And I kept replying that way. And eventually, since he didn't know how to handle it, he grabbed my passport, threw it at me, and said, "Get out of my sight, you're pathetic." And I escaped from prison, as it were, using a little bit of that kind of cultural understanding. So sometimes, you know, I get myself into bad situations, but sometimes I can get myself out of them. Yeah.
So I was studying Chinese for 1-2 years, studying on my own. Some stage I had my first conversation with somebody, and I realized I didn't know the word, the sentence for "can you repeat again" or "please can you talk slower." Do you have a list of basic sentences that you like in a meta language, as in, you know, these kind of words that you find that you need to use more often than not when you start a new language?
Absolutely. No. I always try to learn those, but instead of saying, "I'm sorry, can you repeat that again?" I just learn the word "again." It's a lot easier. It's a lot less complicated. It's a lot less intimidating. So I would say, 再见, you know, again. And then they know. And then maybe after a month or so, I'll actually give a more proper way of saying that. But I would learn single words. What single word can get you the best bang for your buck? I always think Pareto principle-wise, what 20% can give me 80% of the results? And I'm not trying to get it perfect. I just want to achieve something. And then another thing with Mandarin, especially, people always forget this with any language that you learn, and something that I tried to like really dive into in these courses was to get people to see all the words they already know. And this is very prominent in European languages. We have a lot of loan words people can use. But in Mandarin, I try to see what are the words I already know. And there are words you know already. There are loan words. There are some words that are kind of building up and getting used in kind of slang situations. So like on phone calls, you could say, "bye-bye." You know, when people would ask me where I'm from, I would say, "Ireland." And you have like not just country names, but brand names. And you have people's names. Like if you don't know how to say the word for president, then use the word for Obama, because that's going to be the same. So I would try to think along those lines, because then that is the thing I would do before I need to memorize things. And then with memorizing them, I would try to come up with quirky mnemonics. I try to see, is there some way I could tie in the vocabulary with something else that I know? And that helps to just like have something ready to spit out. Because the last thing you want to be doing is to overthink it when the situation comes up. But yeah, for generally, what I do when I'm starting to learn language is come up with things I'm likely to say often. So I do not try to learn the word for curtain, because that's very unlikely to come up in conversation. But on a call, like a video call, I'm going to very likely need to say, "repeat, please." And "can you write?" "Can you write" is a very good one, or "can you type?" Because then they're going to have something you can actually go off and use very quickly. And I don't feel bad about having them wait. If I'm like paying for the lesson, then they're just going to have to wait, you know. And I go off, look it up, and then I continue the conversation. So yeah, I would try to come up with things. I do have like a baseline list, but a lot of the stuff I come up with initially isn't necessarily something I say, "Okay, everyone, here are the magic words I use. Here they go for you." Because in every language, I've never ever come across a course that teaches me how to say, "I'm Benny, a blogger from Ireland." So when I made this course, I tried to make it a more me-specific thing, to give people the tools they needed to figure out how to fill in those gaps with something relevant to them. Okay?
I think we've got time for one more quick question.
Yeah, thank you very much for the information. It's really useful. So I'm Austrian, and like exploring languages, I had also like, for example, Italian, French, and Spanish. And for me, it was always really difficult to mix those up because you have all those words which are really similar. So my question is, would you say it's easier if I learn a language really well to start off with another language that's really similar, like going from French to Spanish? Or would you say like do something completely else afterwards so the brain can not mixing it up?
I would say, like, whenever people say which language should I learn next, and they say, should it be based on similar, or should it be based on what's harder, what's easier? I always think of this guy I met in Spain while I was learning Spanish, and he had to learn French and Japanese. And he was doing a lot better with Japanese, and I was confused. I was like, well, wouldn't French be easier for you? And he said, no, because I love anime, and I like can't wait for the next manga to come out, and I find Japanese girls hot. And like that was his motivation. And I find whenever you start a new language, if you start thinking of, you know, will I learn this language better because, you know, it has vowel agreements and because some of the words are formed in an agglutinative way, or because of this, or it's in the same language family, that's a very impersonal way of looking at it. That might make sense, you think, from a logical perspective, but I found the next language you should learn should be the language you're most passionate about. And that should be what's driving you, regardless of if it's similar, because if it's similar, you'll find a way. Maybe technically it'll be like 5% harder because it's similar, but maybe it'll be 20% easier because you care about it more. So all of those things. The same when people ask me, what's the hardest language you've ever learned? I always tell them it was kind of Spanish. It wasn't Chinese or Hungarian or Quechua. It was Spanish because I didn't really care about it for the first 6 months that I was trying to learn. I was just kind of putting in the work, and I put in a lot of hours to get nothing out of it. So, but since then, I've cared about the culture. I've seen a language, like, people are surprised when I tell them this. I actually don't care about language learning. I care about talking to people. For me, a language is a means to an end. It's my tool that lets me open doors. So that lets me get through it quicker. So I don't care if it's similar to this language, or if it's in a different language family, or anything like that, or does it have tones, or does it have 7 cases? I don't care, because regardless, I'll find a way to figure out those issues if they come up. What matters is, do I want to learn that language? So I would try to see that. I would try to see, is there some part of the culture? Is there somebody you know you really want to talk to? Would you like to visit the country soon? Whatever it is, focus on that if you're comparing 2 languages and say, which one comes out on top as the one you want to learn more? Okay? So that's it. Thank you very much for coming, everybody.